The promise of queer joy, spicy romance, or a faithful relationship. All just to draw people in, earn their coin, and then drop them with a laugh. Queerbaiting practices have been criticized for years now and opened up debates about popular shows and movies. But as of today, is this debate really still relevant? Or does its criticism shift away from other conversations we should be having? Many questions, many answers. So welcome to the Neffviews episode of Neffviews. Grab your popcorn and let's dive in with the attempts to lure in people with queerness. Well, hello everyone. Welcome back to the show, or maybe it's your very first hello from me, in case you're also watching this maybe as a video podcast or even on YouTube. This will be the very first time that there's a video going up with an episode. So in case it's the first time you hear me or you're seeing me right now, hi, I'm Lena, your Neffviews hostess and film nerd with an appetite for deep dives. Today, I'm here with a little something new and a little something different from previous podcast episodes. This episode marks the very first Neffviews, as I would like to call them. Those are shorter deep dives that center around a very specific topic and or specific question for us to explore. As I've already mentioned in the beginning, this week we are honing in on the queerbaiting debacle. You know, John Locke on Sherlock, Destiel on Supernatural, or Chloe on Pitch Perfect. Can we talk about how funny some of these shipping names are, by the way? Who thinks of these? All of these ships are implied in the subtext, but never officially confirmed. Worse, sometimes even the possibility of them existing in the first place is laughed off or treated as a joke. But there's many forms queerbaiting can take. And let's be honest, not every single person will know the ins and outs of queerbaiting by heart. So let's dial it back a tad and get everyone on board here. The definition of queerbaiting. There is one definition of queerbaiting that gets referenced over and over. So that's the one that we're going to be looking at here too. The definition was given by Judith Fathallah in 2015, and she states queerbaiting as a strategy by which writers and networks attempt to gain the attention of queer viewers via hints, jokes, gestures, and symbolism, suggesting a queer relationship between two characters, and then empathetically denying and laughing off the possibility. There are other definitions, such as one given by Emma Nording, who goes as far as to name queerbaiting as a form of queer activism, because the criticism highlights queer practices as exploitative and as a reproduction of heterosexism. You know, when heterosexuality is presented as the one true form of sexuality. The debate around who can call out queerbaiting and who it's specifically catering to isn't as clear-cut though. While queerbaiting by definition aims for a queer audience, it's fans of every sexuality, many of them heterosexual, who accuse shows of queerbaiting. That isn't to say that heterosexual people cannot call out problematic practices when they spot them. The opposite should be true, actually. In most cases, we need allies by our side to achieve actual change. Besides, heterosexual viewers can just as well as queer viewers enjoy queer representation on screen, and even root for that queer representation. Drawing a conclusion, we might say that queerbaiting aims for profits from everyone who might enjoy queer representation, while then denying the existence of such representation to more conservative viewers. As such, queerbaiting is usually more relevant for serial formats or for film franchises, since those are more inviting for audiences to participate in hyping them up online, and in case of serial formats, audiences also have time to react to plots and then try to affect plotlines in future episodes. Nordin even states that queerbaiting and its aim to keep audiences hooked seems to require a TV format, since once a movie is released, a quick word of mouth can confirm or refute claims of a queer character. When sequels are in the talks, the same effect of serial formats can be reached, but a standalone film faces challenges in this regard. We will be talking about queerbaiting in both films and serial formats more later on, and I will give my piece of cake on the topic, but let's save that for later. Before then, it's helpful for us to understand where queerbaiting came from, in order for us to grasp why it's criticized today. The origins of queerbaiting. Queerbaiting in its current use has been around since 2010, and since then, fans have claimed the term for themselves. The origins of its current use as a marketing tactic can be traced to marketing campaigns from the 1980s and 90s. These campaigns used homoeroticisms and ambiguous references to reach a queer audience and get some of that pink dollar, aka the gay purchasing power of mainly financially well-off gay men. The result of these campaigns is approximately the same as what queerbaiting accuses producers of doing today, showing something that can be interpreted as mere friendship by heterosexual consumers, and at the same time can be read as queer by the queer community on the basis of codes and subtexts, and then bring them in as a faithful audience. If we go back even further, however, queerbaiting somewhat descends from another practice called queer coding. As the name suggests, queer coding weaves in queerness into the subtext of stories and depictions, via codes and subtextual hints. In relation to the film industry, queerbaiting was one of the only ways to include queerness in moving images in the first place back in the days. The reason for that in the United States, for example, was a censorship of motion pictures in the 1920s and 30s, called the Motion Picture Production Code, also known as the Hays Code, named after William Hays, who was the head of the Motion Picture Producers and Distributors of America, which was the organization who back then passed the code. While harmful to a certain degree, when combined with presenting movie villains as queer, for instance, queer coding is often not seen as malicious. The opposite, actually. It's a way to represent queer characters and queer themes without explicitly naming them as such, as to not be affected by censorship. So, if queerbaiting dates back to queer coding, then why is the second one considered as okay in most instances, while the first one is considered harmful? All about intentions. The main criticism in the queerbaiting debate is the potential of exploitation, and the reason for that hinges on intent. When a show is accused of queerbaiting, it's accused of trying to profit from queer minorities without actually giving honest representation to these minorities. The implied queerness on screen is denied either by joking about it or outright stating the implication isn't even there. This denial then becomes a means for ignorance by producers and creators. This not only can pit viewers against one another, depending on whether they read into the queer codes or not, but it also denies queer viewers or queer-interested viewers a queer resolution. The feeling that could then arise might be that queer love and or identity is only okay as long as it's not fully realized, left in the darkness of implication and subtext. Joseph Brennan even calls out producers who queerbait for engaging in gaslighting, aka manipulating their audience to sell them a fake reality, to convince them that the queerness they're perceiving is actually not really there. As such, queerbaiting is considered even worse than erasure, as put by Emma Norden, because it promises representation just to take it away and effectively, my words now, spit on it. You know, like the Hawk Tuah girl, just spit on that thing. I should not be referencing the Hawk Tuah girl in a debate about queerbaiting, should I? Yeah, probably not. What queerbaiting criticizers argue is that subtext and codes are no longer needed in modern days. Views on queerness in the broader society of, for example, the United States, have shifted according to these people, and queer people are more accepted than they used to be. Is this a valid argument, though, or are there more layers to queerbaiting today that we should be taking into consideration? On the subject of subtext. Matter of fact is, we live in a global world with backsteps of queer rights, even in quote-unquote progressive societies. Just take a glance at the United States right now. There is immense backlash against queer people, especially against trans people. And the second Trump administration is pushing back hard against anything that has to do with diversity. So, while yes, queerness is supported in many more parts of society, it's not like we're living in a perfect world for queer people, where they can just be themselves everywhere. Now, many are aware of this exact thing. That's precisely why they're calling for a need of explicit representation, since the media is one of the only places people without queer friends or acquaintances can encounter queer realities. However, production studios don't necessarily use national conservatives as a reason to queerbait. They put their eyes on those overseas to justify subtextual inclusion. In a global economy, the film market and its intended audience is just as international. Especially mainstream media tries to appeal to as many people as possible, to be as profitable as possible. This makes it hard to pin down what kind of representation is actually possible without censorship. Huge markets like China, for instance, still criminalize queerness and restrict representation. Here, codes are necessary for any kind of queer depiction, and that's reminiscent of the US American Motion Picture Production Code of the 1920s or 1930s. If anything, having to consider an international market complicates the debate around subtext being no longer necessary. And yet, again, there's layers to this. There's a fine line between subtext and a blatant denial of any queer inclusion by creators. The internationality of blockbusters also shouldn't be used as an excuse, as to say that they couldn't afford any queer inclusion. It's not like US American movies aren't censored either way in other countries, even when they try to be slick with their moving pictures. And while subtext and queerbaiting both hinge on an author's intent of tying encoded queerness into the texts, queerbaiting does not try to validate the queerness shown in said texts. That's got us circling back to intent again, because fans do consider how creators treat their subtexts, and the fans who talk of queer possibilities. This distinction also shows, though, that we shouldn't outright dismiss subtext. If we did, we risk oversimplifying homoerotic subtexts of certain texts. As Joseph Brennan argues, and I would agree with him here, we shouldn't negate inclusions of homoerotic subtext from the start, and we also shouldn't negate its enjoyment by those receiving the texts. Relishing queer subtext without explicit confirmation is, or should still be, in my opinion, a justified position to occupy. And even if creators deny the existence of queer possibilities in their texts, can the reception of a text ever truly be detached from the context in which it is received? Not my smart question, by the way, but again, Joseph Brennan's. Credit where credit is due. But for real, when we interpret queer subtext into a work, who can take our queer reading away from us? Who is to say that it's not there when we see ourselves in fictional characters? Which brings us back to our central question of this little queerbaiting excursion. Queerbaiting's relevancy today. Honestly, there isn't a straightforward answer to how we can classify queerbaiting. There is a stark difference between the blatant sexual innuendo between Chloe and Becca in the Pitch Perfect movies that are woven into the film's trailers even, and the subtextual queer reading of a film like Luca. With Luca, one could ask why it matters that the queer relationship isn't explicitly confirmed. Some might say that especially queer kids need to see themselves on screen outright. And yes, I would agree with that. But on the other hand, the text doesn't deny its implied relationship. And just because there isn't a kiss doesn't mean the queerness in the text itself does not exist, no matter what the creators say. Queer subtexts can still be cathartic, and they do have a certain charm to them. Queerbaiting claims can make it seem as though audiences are just dumb, or easily lured in with the hint of a queer relationship, instead of them being very aware of the subtext and maybe even enjoying that exact thing. You can enjoy a film or show and its innuendos while at the same time remaining very aware of how the entertainment industry treats queerness. And also at the same time, acknowledging that the problem lies within producers' tactics and the statements that they make. I find that maybe queerbaiting is still relevant for certain shows and media, but more so in this aforementioned relation to criticizing the authors' or creators' reactions treatments and or outright denials of queer possibilities and laughing those off. This includes criticisms of how the queer possibilities are treated in the text themselves, by the way. You know, there is a valid case to be made about the relationship between Sherlock and John in BBC's Sherlock being a running gag on the show. But sometimes I think that queerbaiting can shift the conversation away from other topics that we should be focusing on. At the center of queerbaiting debates, it's usually white, gay couplings. That's exactly the group, however, that already outweighs other queer identities by a wide margin when it comes to representation. So, are we focusing on the wrong topic to always put the spotlight on? Should we stop hanging on to breadcrumbs given by shows and movies that may never give queer audiences what they want? Shouldn't we instead push for more diverse representation for all identities that are layered and multifaceted in original stories? Or can these debates go hand in hand? I think that they can, and they should. I also think that queerbaiting is still valid in current discourses, and yet we should, in my opinion, hold space for queer subtexts without immediately calling them harmful. And calling for greater, unique, and complex representations in general should be a given. Queer people deserve to see themselves on screen, with all their layers, emotions, and relationships. And at the end of the day, that is what criticisms of queerbaiting call for as well. All right, and with that, we have reached the end of this episode. I hope that I was able to give you some more insights into the topic that maybe you hadn't considered before or that you didn't know about. And even if I didn't, I hope that you still enjoyed me rambling on about queerbaiting. If you like this kind of content and you want more of it, you're in luck because there's already more episodes up on Spotify and other platforms where you can get your podcasts. So you can already go listen to those there. The podcast is called Neffviews. There is also a review podcast, if you're into that sort of thing, called Neff Reviews. Check that one out as well. It will be worth it, I promise you. And if you're someone who rather likes to get these sort of deep dives on YouTube, I will try to also be posting videos with future podcast episodes. So you will usually, in most cases, also be able to get the podcast episodes on there from now on as well. Okay, I have talked enough. Thank you so much for listening or watching whatever you did. It's much appreciated. Don't forget to follow me on Instagram, on YouTube, on Spotify. Leave a like, subscribe to the show on your platform of choice. Whatever you want to do, it's fine. Engaging with my content just shows me that you enjoy what I do and that you are interested in what I'm talking about. And yes, that's it from me today. Thank you so much for being here, and until next time. Bye-bye.